Hi. It is pretty blurry, but I'm gonna say mostly aura by a bit in the front. And we are going to make kind of a Meet the Altars video introducing Rachel, but she will not be fronting for it. As you can see, she's around, but she won't be fronting for the video. And this is also going to serve as an example of how a caretaker could also be a persecutor. So in terms of basic information, Rachel is an elf. She's 34, I believe. Yes, she's 34. She is the host still, probably, of one of our core subsystems, the one we've talked about the least on here, the light core subsystem. And so a version of her has been around since very, very, very early days in terms of our system, in the same way as Jade's subsystem has and my subsystem has, and Anna's. In those early years, she existed for a while without a subsystem, but she was essentially the altar who would later split into the light core subsystem, and she was our major caretaker. She was our only caretaker at first in our system. So to summarize and probably oversimplify a little bit, in the very, very earliest, like very, very beginning of our system, as far as any of us can remember, we had a trauma holder that would later split into Jade's whole subsystem and Michael and his lineage since then, including Jade and Jaden and the subsystem that has split from Jaden since then. And our host, Anna, come on. I'm doing a bunch of grounding things and I'm trying to be able to get complete thoughts out. So, trauma holder, host, gatekeeper, which was my subsystem and like the altar who would later split into my subsystem when I became host, and the entire wolf pack, gatekeepers, etc. And then our caretaker. So I think as of very, very, very early on, there was at least one little, because that's all I know of Rachel's job from that early would have been taking care of littles and very specifically keeping them away from the front and away from the rest of the system. Because soon after, like, Michael split from the, like, original trauma holder pretty quickly. And the arrangement was roughly that Michael was in charge of the front and the front area, and Rachel was in charge of inside. The gatekeeper was somewhat involved in both of those areas, but Rachel was the caretaker at the time and worked like indirectly with Michael in the sense that they had some overlapping goals. Rachel didn't want Little's fronting and Michael didn't want Little's fronting. But beyond that, their roles were very separate. They were intentionally very separate. They stayed out of each other's way and didn't interfere with each other's, like, areas or jobs. But yeah, her internal caretaking role started before we had any internal protectors. So she did essentially a version of that, and Michael did essentially a version of that as it became needed, like as there were more alters around who had any access to each other or awareness of each other at all. Rachel would keep Littles safe and away from any of those situations and away from the front, and Michael would deal with the rest. And I think we have talked some in various contexts where we've talked about Michael before, but he couldn't prioritize feelings because his job revolved around safety. And he didn't particularly care about feelings. He didn't think they mattered in the grand scheme of everything that was going on. And in a way, Rachel arguably cared too much about feelings versus safety. Whatever was happening in or around the front didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the safety and comfort of the littles who she took care of. As far as I know, Rachel didn't directly split until around the same time that Anna's subsystem split, and for, in some ways, some overlapping reasons. It was during that massive system restructuring that we've talked about some when I ended up becoming host. During that time, Rachel split her subsystem and some other splits as well. we're not currently sharing much of anything about any of those splits. We're not really going to go into any detail about her subsystem or other splits from her. Except that some of them were her kids, in the same way as I have some kids in our inner world and Jade does. We've talked about that some on here. Anna does too. I think we've talked about all three of those at least a little bit on here before. Rachel is another one of the alters who split kids like that. Who like have that relationship with her, of her being their mom. That, if anything, made her more protective of littles, as you might imagine, but also involved not being the only caretaker anymore. There were other caretakers in her subsystem, but also Anna's role had started involving more caretaking when she wasn't hosting anymore, and those numbers increased over time with different splits and alters growing up, etc., who ended up in that role. But Rachel was our like primary and executive caretaker for almost our entire existence. When I started finding out about the system, so the next major restructuring, well, one of the next, I think the college one was in between technically, and I think we counted that as a major restructuring. I don't know, but we have a video talking about major times that like our system changed a lot all at once, and we go into a lot of this there, but I'm focusing on how those things like involved Rachel essentially in this video. So when I found out about the system, and the system was starting to rebel essentially against Michael and his control as a Persecutor protector, Rachel was reluctant to support Jade taking over that role as primary protector instead, because she had worked with, not really directly, but had worked alongside Michael, like with an understanding between them for years and years, and had bad experiences with Jade during her time as a Persecutor, but also had Rachel blamed Jade for some splits of littles who were trauma holders and had to hold things that they shouldn't have had to hold. And while that was also true with Michael, it was much more common with Jade. Rachel also, just in general, was more comfortable with Michael's overprotective and keep it all hidden mindset and agenda, basically. But she did come around eventually, because Michael was crossing too many lines and other executives were outnumbering her, and some of the lines that he crossed were personal that she couldn't accept or allow, essentially, without doing anything about it. There was a period at some point after that, after a while, where she went dormant for a while. I don't remember when or why. But then more recently, recently measured in, I think, years, maybe lots of months, but I think years. So within the past few years, she had a stretch of suddenly doing more direct persecutor behavior, basically, still stemming from like the overprotective mindset, but to the point of restricting freedom a lot of littles, especially her kids, but other littles as well. And she took it way too far, including cutting them off completely from the rest of the system, including their access to other littles who they were friends with or other caretakers who they felt safe with and trusted. And this was against their will, and when there was no active danger that justified such an extreme response. But there were things leading up to that as well, before it got that extreme, where she essentially pushed the idea that anyone qualified to be a caretaker should prioritize that role over anything else, even if they were more qualified for something else, or we desperately needed help with something else that they were qualified for. She didn't think anything else could matter more. She also internalized some beliefs that caused her to protect, from her perspective, littles from things that were actually safe or good or neutral. So again, the idea of being overprotective, but some of that was also based in harmful internal beliefs, internalized beliefs, essentially. We dealt with that in ways involving a lot of internal protectors and caretakers stepping in and restricting her ability to do those things, essentially, while trying to work on getting through to her in other ways, but prioritizing the safety aspects of that first. Her subsystem has made a lot of progress in dismantling those beliefs, and they are primarily the ones who are keeping an eye on her and working with her generally and restricting her when necessary. She can't be an executive as an active persecutor. That's one of the rules that we have in our subsystem, in not our subsystem, in our system overall about executives, is active persecutors can't be executives. but her subsystem is still often consulted, especially about caretaking related things. And we might be able to go into more detail, for instance, with like alter relationship type videos of like her relationship with Michael and her relationship with Jade and Anna and etc. But for now, that's kind of an overview, essentially, of Rachel over the years and how a caretaker being overprotective can lead to persecutor behaviors. It's not the only way that a caretaker can be a persecutor, but it is one of the ways, and it's the way that is relevant here. Although arguably she had some at least borderline persecutor behaviors towards other alters who she saw as a threat in any way against the little she was protecting. So that can be another way that can happen, but that is the overview that we're given for right now. Feel free to ask questions, but as always, we won't share more than we're comfortable with. And these are the things that, after months and months of working with her, since all of that happened, these are the things that she is comfortable with sharing and that the rest of us are comfortable with sharing. So that is the overview of introducing Rachel. Let us know what you think about, I was gonna say the new background, but I think that was up last time, so never mind. Still feel free to let us know what you think, I guess, if you haven't yet. Or if I'm wrong about that and it wasn't up for our last video, but I like it. I think it's cute. Feel free to put questions or other video ideas and things like that in the comments or on Discord or on Patreon. And all of those things are below. The links to everything below me, it will be in the description, and comments obviously are below that. But also make sure to like the video if you liked it, and subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't yet, to make sure you see when we post other stuff you might be interested in. We are working towards 1,000 subscribers right now, but we're doing it in chunks of 50 at a time to try to keep like excitement and momentum going. So we will be doing more compilations to celebrate those mini milestones on the way. So if you haven't subscribed yet, you can be part of hitting one of those mini milestones coming up and then getting an extra switching compilation for it. So yeah. I don't think I'm missing anything too important, so thank you so much for watching. Bye! Well, that's the first part where it kind of sounded like me. Oh well.